Welcome to The Beat. I'm Ari Melber, and we are covering the late breaking news out of Los Angeles. Late today, the latest development in a clash that seems escalated by the federal government under the Trump administration includes now a small number of U.S. Marines formally mobilized to respond to this ongoing clash and the protests. Today's protests, and you can see some of the footage, and we've been tracking this, are overwhelmingly peaceful across the city there. The escalation, though, has little precedent in modern times to see the Guard deployed as it was over the weekend without a governor's cooperation. The Marines now will support, reportedly, what are still hundreds of National Guard troops that are on the ground in LA under the Trump order and during the objection of the California governor, Gavin Newsom. He's now filed a lawsuit on that front as well, and we're going to run through all of that with you tonight. But a little historical context. This is the first time a United States president has had to clash with or ignore a governor in the deployment of the National Guard all the way back to 1965. The circumstances then quite different after years of back and forth and cases and lawsuits and new federal legislation. President Johnson ultimately made what was then still a very big move to send troops to Alabama without a governor's collaboration in order to protect the civil rights under law that had been established by both federal legislation and years of case law. The point being, whatever one thinks about the immigration issues in our country today, there is no recent precedent whatsoever for a president bringing out the Guard the way Donald Trump did quite quickly this weekend. Now, critics say the goal here, what we continue to see, is not actually about immigration, but about an effort documented and sometimes admitted by President Trump in the second term to expand his authority, to test his legal powers, and at times to exert a kind of autocratic intimidation campaign that includes arresting critics, threatening people who disagree, trampling on First Amendment and free speech rights, and saying, as he did today, that the opposition can be arrested for little to no reason at all. That is both the criticism and at times the confession from the Trump administration. Having reported that, this is also complicated because there are ways that immigration powers are stronger and broader than other powers a president has, and there were reports of some violence and thus lawlessness over the weekend. Now, top local officials say that violent incidents did occur, and we've documented that. The news has reported that basically from its inception over the weekend, but that those were under control. That is to say, there was no need for a federal National Guard emergency response. And in addition, the largest number of protesters over what is now these 3+ days have been peaceful. Now, here's that lawsuit. California is formally suing the president, saying that he legally overstepped his authority, invoking this law to send in troops, using the same kind of war powers or extreme claims that we've seen already rejected in different immigration contexts by the Supreme Court. Because in order to do this, the president and his lawyers are basically arguing that there is some sort of actual invasion or rebellion. There is no actual rebellion under the legal case law and what that term has always meant. There are instead protests, which is a First Amendment constitutionally protected right. The New York Times notes the situation has all the elements that the president seeks, a showdown with a top rival in a deep blue state over an issue core to his agenda. Trump also attacked Governor Newsom today and made what are clearly outrageous types of statements. In other words, whether we are accustomed 130 days into the second term or not, whether we are accustomed to this, where we've heard this. We saw the president last week threatening his one-time ally, Elon Musk, with the type of retaliation that would typically be unlawful, if not outright illegal, going after somebody's businesses for their free speech. Well, here is what the president admits he's okay with or could do against a Democratic opponent.
What crime has Governor Newsom committed?
A crime has he committed?
Yeah, to warrant his arrest, as you
I think his
suggested earlier.
primary crime is running for governor because he's done such a bad job.
No actual answer there. You could call it a joke, but at a time where multiple Democratic officials have been arrested, some cases dropped, some continue, not much of a joke theme to land there. Now, the president is testing his powers. Moments ago, labor leader David Huerta was released from custody after being held for 3 nights in detention. He was charged with a felony of conspiracy to impede an officer. Now, he is speaking now, and we're going to keep an eye on all of these breaking developments here, as it is, of course, an ongoing scene, although not necessarily the emergency that the president has sometimes suggested over the weekend. With that in mind, we turn to our experts. We have NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff, who's been reporting live in Los Angeles, Maya Wiley, a former SDNY civil prosecutor and a president of the Civil and Human Rights Leadership Conference, so she knows a lot about the speech and other protest rights that we mentioned, and Jose Luis Solache Jr., California State Assemblyman representing parts of LA. We should note, again, as part of what we're following here with both experts and participants, he was tear gassed on Saturday while protesting these policies.
Got these just through some sort of spray in our eyes.
Jacob, I come to you first. Tell us both the context here and the latest.
Ari, you and Governor Newsom both have said similar things that I have heard over the course of the last 24 hours, which is while immigration is what started all of this, democracy is what is on the line today in Los Angeles and throughout the United States. But what I'm doing here at this Home Depot in the Cypress Park neighborhood of Los Angeles is trying to remind everybody of how this all started on Friday. This started as federal immigration agents. I think we have some video from both this location on the left-hand side of your screen. You're looking at what's happening downtown right now in the ongoing protest. But what got those protesters to the streets is what happened at this Home Depot on Friday morning and at other locations throughout the city and the county of Los Angeles on Friday. And that was wide-scale, some might say indiscriminate, immigration enforcement against people like day laborers. That's what you're looking at here. And when I say indiscriminate, I mean, more broadly speaking, these are not people who would normally be targeted by the folks that you're looking at on your screen. This is the first time we've shown this footage here on MSNBC. The corner I'm standing on right now on Figueroa Street in Cypress Park in Los Angeles is a place where day laborers stand every single day to go be hired by the people of Los Angeles to perform tasks menial and important in homes and in businesses to make a day's living wage, as some of the 25,000 or so day laborers who are not violent criminal offenders, but many of whom happen to be undocumented in this city. And the people that came out and protested when I was on the streets on Friday night were on the streets in the same places you're seeing the pictures on the left-hand side of your screen to stick up for the rights of people who normally would be on this corner today, but instead are home scared because of the actions of the Trump administration, are home scared because they wouldn't historically be targeted by the federal government for immigration enforcement, yet instead have been rounded up over the course of the last 3 days in an immigration enforcement policy that was laid out and effectuated since the Republican convention, a mass deportation program. There are real people at the middle of all of this, and that's why I'm out here today, to remind everyone that those protests, while they might be violent at times, are really about a peaceful support for a community that's at the heart of Los Angeles, Ari.
Jacob, thank you for your reporting and the context there, and we will keep checking in with you as a news network. So again, thanks. I want to bring in Jose Luis Solache now. Tell us what you experienced, what you think people should know about what happened over the weekend and today in LA.
Yes, thank you for having us here in this show. You know, in my community, a hardworking community of hardworking members, we had a staging of immigration officers from Border Patrol specifically. There was vehicles, over 25 Border Patrol vehicles, over 35 SUVs with unmarked that were coming to a facility across the street from a Home Depot in the city of Paramount, my district, where I proudly represent. And you know, organically, people started stopping. They saw the vehicles. They started being alarmed. Of course, this is after the night before on Friday, where things just escalated to a different level of the news was spreading wide that, you know, we had agents in Los Angeles. So, of course, community reacted with they don't want them in our community. So that's what happened. They were staging to go out to other communities and raid parts of Los Angeles.
Yeah. And stay with me, please. I want to bring in as well Maya Wiley and turn to the legality and the history here, Maya. There are times where it is legal for a president to bring in the National Guard without, for example, a governor, although it's rare, hasn't happened in 60 years. And here, the way that the president brought in the Guard and the claimed authorities they want to use around the Marines don't seem to have much support. Can you walk us through that and how, even apart from the immigration issue, where there's a lot of debate about what to do about the level of migration, what are the separate legal vulnerabilities for the president here?
Yeah, Ari, I so appreciated you raising in your setup that typically what we see is we have Posse Comitatus Act. That's just the fancy way of saying, look, a president just can't turn the military onto civilians to do civilian law enforcement. That's what law enforcement is on the ground in the form of police departments. And the National Guard is under the governor. So and there's a long history behind that I won't go into, but the point is the exceptions to that is the Insurrection Act. The exception to saying you can't do this is the Insurrection Act that says you have to, as you said, have an invasion or a rebellion or something else bad that clearly is about people coming in and trying to take over the actions and abilities of federal government to be federal government. That's not what's happening here. It's not what happened here. What we had was peaceful demonstrations, as you said, and we've been hearing from our members on the ground, parts of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I should acknowledge that David Huerta, the union leader of Service Employees International Union, who's pending criminal charges, that union is a member of the Leadership Conference as well. And everything we've been hearing is people were showing up because they were hearing the rights of other people being violated. They were peacefully protesting, and both the LA sheriff, the governor, and the mayor of Los Angeles all said, we're good, we're fine, we got this. So typically, unless you have a state like during Selma, like during Bloody Sunday, when protesters like John Lewis were just trying to peacefully cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to protest for voting rights, and law enforcement in Alabama let mobs hurt people. One man was killed. And as we know, we've seen the famous footage for that. That was one of the rare exceptions where a president says, I don't care, governor, if you don't want me to come in. You are not protecting the rights of Black people and allies who are protesting to protect their own rights. So this is the flip of that. And really what Gavin Newsom with the state of California is saying in the litigation they brought is, where do you and how do you fit into this exception? This exception that says, there's an invasion, there's not, that we need you, we don't. And generally speaking, and our history has been that unless a governor says, please do come, please do bring help and force, that it doesn't happen. So this is a
So
radical.
let me jump in on that point. So what do you think is happening? Do you think that there is enough evidence to say that the administration is trying to both test and overwhelm by saying, I mean, this is not military everywhere, but Newsom pointed out that the claim is that they could exercise this authority. That's what the administration says it wants to do, could do anywhere in the country. That they're using immigration and what were some violent incidents over the weekend as a test case to then go farther than we've seen in 60 years. And then with the Marines, again, we're not reporting that there's military across the country. We're not seeing an invocation of the Insurrection Act, which, as you mentioned, is the formal way to say you want a type of martial law, you get the military on the home front. So do you view this as something incompetent or something more sinister, with critics saying this is a test run to see how far they can go so that they can then potentially do this larger in more places in the future?
It's sinister. And we know it's sinister because, look, number one, we saw Donald Trump want to misuse the military during his first term. We saw that Donald Trump in Trump 1.0 said and wanted to call out the military. We saw what he did in the loopholes he found when we had Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington, D.C., near the White House, peacefully protesting, and we saw the awful way in which he utilized his loophole to get other governors to send their forces to basically disrupt peaceful protesters because he didn't like their protests. And we saw it in Project 2025. There's references in Project 2025 written by Trump acolytes
Yeah.
and, frankly, some organizations that were flat out extremist organizations that really said we should see this next administration abuse this kind of power against protests. And Donald Trump
Yeah.
campaigned on it. He made very explicit and
Right.
clear that he wanted the power of what we would call an authoritarian, not the power of what we
Right.
would call a president. And this
And
is
I'm
an
jumping
example of
in. I'm going to jump in to give the Assemblyman one more answer. But as Maya explains, that's what a court may also review. What are the past confessions and claims which undercut the idea that this is just for LA's public security? Assemblyman, again, thanks for being with us. Your final thoughts tonight before I lose you.
Just a final thought. I mean, we have 10 million people in Los Angeles. These are isolated issues that have happened throughout our county, and there's not a war zone in our county. We want our president to end these raids. We want the president to end these 2,000 / now 500, 700 Marines. That's no, there's no need for that. Our community is hardworking. Our community is strong, and we want to make sure that that if there are protests out there, that they're peaceful, and that we show our disappointment with this happening by the President of the United States. And I remind him that there's no war zone. We're a strong community, and we look forward for him to stop these raids happening in our own backyards.
Yeah. And it's a tense time for many reasons, both what's happened, but also to some degree, apparently, part of the federal response. Assemblyman Solace and Maya Wiley, my thanks to both of you. We're going to fit in our shortest break, 90 seconds, when we come back, a legal breakdown on what limits are being tested or exceeded, and later, the questions on law enforcement handling the protests and even journalists.
Firing rubber bullets at protesters, moving them on through the heart of LA.
We are covering what's been happening in LA in an ongoing story. The president is clearly trying to test the bounds of the law and going beyond over half a century of precedent, deploying these National Guard troops in LA with his stated reasons, including what they call ICE's authority and public security, but also with another agenda. We have these live pictures from LA. Trump did not collaborate or cooperate with the state governor, where there's usually exercised dual authority in the use of the National Guard. Instead, he invoked a statute, which he asserts, and this could be ultimately confirmed or denied in court, but his team says that gives them the ability to call these units into this type of federal service. That U.S. code, though, requires an invasion or rebellion or a situation where the president cannot faithfully execute the laws through regular forces. Now, Trump has said the protests are prohibiting ICE from doing what they need to do, their lawful duties, and that it thus meets the definition of a, quote, rebellion. Now, there just isn't a lot of case law to support that. So courts can decide anything. They also can sometimes duck cases that they don't want to take. But in the modern era, there is not good case law or precedent for that claim. The New York Times notes the statute itself does not confer authority to use federal troops in the way that Trump wants, and that no president has done this without the permission of state governors since the civil rights movement, the precedent we mentioned, which, again, cuts against Trump because there was literally years of lead up to that ultimate use without the governor, rather than what really exploded over the weekend with the Trump administration deciding to make a point here. Now, Trump also discussed and sometimes backed down on his musings or assertions to aides that he wanted to use the military more forcefully, including to break up protests. It's also something, and a previous guest mentioned tonight, that he talked about on the campaign trail.
One of the other things I'll do, because, you're supposed to not be involved in that. You just have to be asked by the governor or the mayor to come in. The next time, I'm not waiting.
That was March 2023. It was on his mind. We've all seen Donald Trump, the reality show star, the entertainer, and the claims and defenses around him that everything is a joke, or he doesn't know exactly what he's doing, or he just floats ideas. Here you actually see on the record the opposite. Reliable claims from senior leaders, including in military and law enforcement in the federal administration, last time saying he tried to do this stuff. Then you have him on the campaign trail musing about it. I'm not waiting. I'm going to do it without the governor. also showing that he's aware of that general tradition, not that you can never take an exception, but the tradition long-standing that you don't do it without the governor, and this time he's not waiting. So California is trying to push back in the courts while dealing with the emergency. They are arguing that judges should rule against Trump on the idea that he basically infringed on the California legal role, or the federalism, the two types of power that we have in this country, something we've reported on in this very program. Governor Newsom says, in his view, the whole thing is federal illegal powers by Trump.
It specifically notes, and under what the DOD did, is they had to coordinate with the governor of the state. They never coordinate with the governor of the state. There's a protocol, there's a process. He didn't care about that. It's Orwellian. Simply lying to people. Unconstitutional, illegal act, his mess. We're trying to clean it up.
Now, that is the governor's view. Some of this comes down to truth. In other words, was there coordination? Did that truly happen or not? The governor says no. Trump and his aides have suggested otherwise. The governor said he's a, quote, stone cold liar. Trump has been caught making many falsehoods, but we're going to need a little more evidence and reporting, which may come up in court, about whether the governor is right. If he is, that could cut against Trump in court. And remember, National Guard is this quasi thing. It's this hybrid state federal thing. But if a judge or a senior federal court says you don't follow this order, or this order is unlawful from the president, well, then that's the end of that until and unless the Supreme Court intervenes. So we might learn more about this in short order. Meanwhile, Trump wants the Pentagon to dispatch personnel potentially anywhere for these laws. We mentioned this earlier in the broadcast. This is very important because some experts see that as a chilling sign that this is not a one-off in California this weekend, but a test case where Trump is, quote, prepared to send troops into other cities in response to protests. Now, take it all together and keep in mind that while there were incidents of violence, and there certainly have been physical clashes over deportation and ICE authorities, we've been all seeing that and covering that, what we are talking about at its core is the first right that's in the Constitution, and not one that's very confused or debatable. The very First Amendment, the right to speech and the right to peacefully assemble. And there is no precedent in the modern era that has ever held up that you can go and take people's peaceful speech and protest and send in the troops. If that's what they have in mind on a repeat basis, well, they have in mind a very different country. We have our legal expert, Ankush Khardori, joining us to break this down next.
What are those guns for? Are they to shoot protesters? I mean, there's no reason to be here with the National Guard.
Any violence against police officers should not be accepted. But remember, a lot of these peaceful protests are being generated because the President of the United States is sowing chaos and confusion by arresting people who are showing up for their immigration hearings, who are trying to abide by the law.
Some of the pushback there from Democratic officials on the weekend's developments. We're joined by a former federal prosecutor, Ankush Khardori, who knows these issues well, and now writes about them for Politico. Welcome. And point blank, how extreme are these measures that the president has chosen to take over the weekend? And what is the likelihood that they may be unlawful?
I think they're quite extreme, very disproportionate, and pretextual, I think, at least given the stated rationale. The terms of the likelihood of a successful court challenge, you know, that's really unclear to me. As you've noted, there's not a lot of precedent, at least in our lifetimes, for a situation like this. It's not like there's a clear roadmap for a court to pick up a case like this and figure out what the standard should be, what kind of evidence should be admitted, what is the relevant information that should be adduced. Courts generally, I think, try to avoid weighing in on issues like this on the theory that the executive branch is more competent to deal with these sorts of military issues than they are. And then, of course, you have a broader issue, which is, could a court even intervene quickly enough to issue some sort of order that would put a halt to this, or will it all kind of blow over, ideally, blow over quickly and before a court needs to step in? So, you know, there are a lot of issues hanging around here. I think, though, to me, the sort of clearest and most dispositive issue is that there is not a rebellion in Los Angeles. That's the statutory predicate for the administration's actions. There are other arguments that California has raised, but to me, that's the critical one. There's not a rebellion. There just simply isn't. There are a bunch of protests. There's some sporadic violence, which is illegal, and we should police appropriately, but that's not the same thing as a rebellion.
Yeah, there's no rebellion, and there isn't even the scale of protests that gets into mass safety issues, which, while not a rebellion, raise harder questions, which America has seen. We've had mass protests, sometimes in more than one city. We've had marches on Washington. We've had gatherings that go for days in some places at a higher scale than this. And then you have tougher questions of law enforcement that still don't reach the level of saying it's a rebellion. I do want to draw your attention and viewers to the legal setbacks that the administration has faced, because they've dialed this up over the weekend, right after yielding to a Supreme Court ruling formally on Friday, in a process that took some time, but where the administration returned Abrego Garcia, who had been mistakenly deported to the wrong country. That wasn't even in dispute. The question was whether they would follow the Supreme Court order to facilitate his return. And so then over this weekend, having yielded in one place where they comply with a court order, and that is the actual legal outcome of what had been quite a serious matter that went all the way up to the Supreme Court with a 7-2 loss, they turn around and on the weekend have something where they can look like, and in some sense be, on quote offense or pushing other powers. As a student of how this all works, who's also been inside, the executive branch yourself in a certain way, do you think there's a link here? And do you think that that's part of the problem of the endless theatrics of the Trump administration? They didn't want much time or attention on what ultimately turned out to be them yielding to the high court.
Yeah, I think that you've touched on two very important issues, I think. One is that this sort of legal strategy is consistent with a strategy we've seen repeatedly since the start of this administration, with concerns invoking these emergency powers, these obscure laws, in order to deal with problems that are not emergencies, right? We saw this when they invoked trade deficits as an emergency for the tariff framework. That was rejected recently by the Court of International Trade, but that's up on appeal. In the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia and a bunch of the other deportations, there's been this claim that the Alien Enemies Act should be invoked, or has properly been invoked, because we're somehow at war with or engaged in hostilities with Venezuela or Nicaragua, which is simply not true. This is a very problematic trend for a democracy, having emergency powers laws being invoked so regularly and almost becoming the norm. The second thing I would say concerning sort of the politics around this is that there is plenty of reason for Trump to want to draw attention away from what is going on in the rest of his administration. He promised the economy would improve quickly after he came into office. That has not happened. He promised he would end 2 different wars quickly after he came into office. That has not happened. He promised that his tariffs would bring along an economic resurgence. That has not happened, and the 90 deals in 90 days have not remotely emerged. The bill, that his big, beautiful bill that's moving through Congress, is on the bubble now, because the Senate, it's not clear that he'll be able to keep all the Republicans in line in the Senate. We shall see. So he has faced a number of challenges on many of his core political promises. This is the one, immigration, where he's gotten some traction, and he's chosen now to escalate this in an area where there's very little for the other branches to do, at least quickly, in the way of putting in some sort of brakes on the process.
Mm-hmm. Really important breakdown that you just gave us with that context. I appreciate it, Ankush. Thanks for being here. By the end of the hour, we look at why people are comparing this to other autocratic moments in recent history. But next, the scrutiny on the law enforcement response. Los Angeles has quieted some today. We've been tracking various interactions, including the tense scenes and the fallout from them over the weekend. One reporter was caught in the middle of basically what we call a live hit, reporting on what was happening, and hit with a rubber bullet while reporting live on air.
Firing rubber bullets. The LAPD moving in on horseback, firing rubber bullets at protesters, moving them on through the heart of LA. What? You shot the...
You okay? A difficult scene in the footage suggests one of the officers there appearing to point towards that area. Aerial footage also showed officers on horseback, at times stomping on an individual who appeared to be just on the ground at that point. The LAPD has spoken repeatedly about aspects of the protest, but not responded to some of the specific claims of what looks like excessive force. We're joined by Antonio Villaraigosa, who is the mayor of Los Angeles, and so has dealt with all types of these scenarios, including overseeing law enforcement and the tense history of that city. We should note he's also running for governor of California, although frankly, we thought of you more as a veteran on these serious issues than a candidate. I just got to say that you're both. Welcome back.
Ari, it's good to be on the show. Sorry that you're not in LA, but so that you can see what's really going on. Most of the violence that occurred the other day was in Paramount. It's a city south east of LA. There was some sporadic violence in LA, but today most of the crowds were peaceful. In fact, I went to the site early this morning asking for people to, in the tradition of Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and Rosa Parks, to engage in demonstrations peacefully. This is a country, after all, where we have a right to demonstrate. However, they should be peaceful and not violent.
Yeah, and there were, as you say, and we've reported some instances of violence. Based on what we know, do you think the LAPD has done its level best, or do you think that there have been moments of what on camera looked like possibly excessive force?
I think they've done their best. Look, there's always an after action report where everything is reviewed and where they look critically at mistakes that were made, at things that were done right. And I'm sure the mayor will order that one is done and we'll get a better idea. What I'm concerned about and what I've been concerned about over the few days, I think you've been talking about it on your show, Ari, is this power grab on the part of Donald Trump. This is the first time.
Let me jump in.
Yeah.
Let's turn to that, and I want to give you a specific because I asked you about LAPD. That's one thing we're tracking. The power grab part is whether, in essence, the law enforcement of LA and California were sufficient and did not need, from a safety perspective, the feds. And so here's a very renowned legal expert, Stephen Vladeck, who writes about the alternative, that it's a Trump power grab. I wanted your response. He calls it federalizing the California Guard and says there's the possibility that the feature here, that what Trump wants is to do this weekend as a precursor, federalizing a modest number of National Guard troops. And then that's invoked sometime later as a justification for even more aggressive responses to what might be anti-ICE protests, including even using the Insurrection Act. It's possible this step is meant to be, in a sense, look modest, but if it fails, Trump invokes that as a basis to be more aggressive. Do you think that's a fair concern and criticism?
Given his actions over the last months that he's been in office for the second time, given his first term as president, absolutely. Look, this is a man that loves chaos, and he's created the chaos here. He said that he was going to secure the borders. We should secure them. We should have those people at the border. He says they were going after criminals. We should go after those criminals. But military-style mass deportations with people with assault weapons, people with flash bang hand grenades, throwing them into the crowds, people that, with masks like in Russia, we haven't had that in this country. And it seems to me that we need to tone down the rhetoric. Yesterday, I called for challenging this in court. The governor is doing that. I commend him for doing that. We've got a challenge in court. That's the place to do this. We should demonstrate peaceably on the streets of California and wherever, but we should also use the courts to challenge what he's doing here. This is the first time in 60 years, you mentioned it, but that when we did it then, it was to protect the civil rights of human beings and of primarily African Americans in the South. Now it's infringing on those civil rights. That's the difference. And it's not a distinction without a difference. It is a big difference to federalize the National Guard in this way when they weren't asked. You know, the LAPD, the sheriff, the municipal departments in this area can handle crowds. They can handle demonstrations. They have again and again. You said it. When I was mayor, they did it multiple times. They can do that. And when they need to, they'll call in the Guard. But they didn't need to. And they certainly didn't need the Marines.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Marines has been the big development today, which at the level of a few hundred is sort of raises the question of why they're trying to push or establish that as something they may get away with. The former mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, thank you, sir. Good to have you back on the program, even on a day like today. We're going to fit in a break. When we come back, a special guest who says this is a time to look at the lessons of autocratic abuses around the world.
We're going to have troops everywhere. We're not going to let this happen to our country.
Troops everywhere. That is how Donald Trump put it, referencing what has been a very unusual use of the National Guard without cooperation from the sitting state's governor, and now tonight mobilizing a small number of U.S. Marines. This has sparked the larger conversation about the deliberate escalation and Donald Trump's efforts, sometimes quite blatantly confessing his efforts to not only use but abuse government power against his opponents, be it Elon Musk's businesses or arresting the governor of California with whom he's had this disagreement this week. Critics say the ICE raids go beyond just immigration, that the efforts and what you see quite visibly broadcast, the armored trucks, the military tactical gear, the flashbang grenades, the aggressiveness, all of it part of normalizing a type of enforcement that this country has not seen for a very long time, if ever, but that Donald Trump wants to increase. In Washington, people have seen the scenes of tanks arriving by train for what is billed as a 250th anniversary of the Army, but is also being celebrated under this government on President Donald Trump's birthday. With all that in mind, we broaden out for the perspective of what we can learn from recent events as well as history. Atlantic writer Tom Nichols writes that, quote, Trump is using the National Guard as bait. You have a lot of experience in this area. Tell us what you mean by that and what history might teach us about how to respond to what's happening.
Well, autocratic leaders like Trump want people to come out, go into the street, confront the troops, and use that as a pretext for getting more muscle out there. He's putting the National Guard there. He's answering an answer to a question that nobody asked, sending forces that nobody wanted, because he wants to have the video, the images. He wants people to be visibly opposing the National Guard so that he can continue the narrative of saying country's in chaos, only the military can save us. I command the military, not the governor of California, not anybody else. And I am going to lead this army to, restoring peace and order in the United States. I mean, he's setting up a trap, not just for LA. I mean, this is not going to stop in Los Angeles. He himself says it. This is a dry run for things he wants to do in a lot of places. And he's trying to use Los Angeles, I think, to acclimate people to the idea of putting soldiers in the streets.
What's the best way to respond if, as you alluded to, it may not only be meeting him at his chosen location and topic?
Yeah, protesting is the most American thing. I mean, it's in the First Amendment. It's one of our most cherished rights. But I think people have to be strategic about this. If Trump is putting the National Guard in the streets, don't go to where the National Guard is, because the whole point, I think, is to show that this was needless. He's going to send in Marines. I mean, this is insane to talk about putting Marines in the streets where you're talking about largely peaceful demonstrations. But he wants people to confront the Marines. He wants those images, and I think staying away from those areas. I was watching some video that you were running earlier. As a woman screaming at a National Guardsman. That's not going to accomplish anything, and it's simply going to reinforce the narrative that's maybe if the president put the National Guard there, that they ought to be there. And I think that that's a lie, and I don't think people should help Trump further that line. I think they ought to stay away from the Guard and the Marines, and then come. They can't stay out there forever. The military can't stay in every city all the time. There are a lot of days to protest, and the military can't be there every day. And I think this is a good time to just, keep away from military forces, because they don't. My experience, I taught military officers for 25 years. My guess is that a lot of these guys don't want to be there any more than the people of California want them to be there. The National Guardsmen are Californians. They probably don't want to be standing there with guns facing their neighbors. The Marines, this is not what they train for. This is not the kind of mission they want. And I think, just reinforcing that notion that this is not necessary is it's a form of protest itself, I think, but it's more difficult, and it takes a lot more discipline, and it's harder to do.
Yeah. Really interesting, especially the way you're talking about what they're courting, what they want to create. Tom Nichols, thank you. We'll be right back. We've been reporting on another tense day in Los Angeles, where the National Guard has been deployed and a small number of Marines also put forward by the Trump administration to support their work. We'll continue to report on the situation out there. This is our time, so it is up on The Beat with Ari Melber. Thanks for watching.